Hey, welcome everybody. You got Larson Stair here with another episode of Musings of an Entrepreneur. And I am joined today by Alex Raymond. How are you doing today, Alex?
Fantastic, man. Great to see you as always, Larson. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a pleasure to see you again. And we've known each other for, I think, almost 4.5 years now. I met Alex during my Techstars days. He was one of our mentors that we worked with pretty closely. And I've followed you throughout that journey and even beyond that and watching a lot of the work that you've been doing here. And we've been really excited to chat with you a little bit more about account management, the post-sale side of customer management, really within your wheelhouse here. But before we get into any of that stuff, would you mind just giving a little bit of a background on yourself, a little bit of an introduction for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, you and I connected when you were going through Techstars back several years ago. And I went through Techstars myself in 2014. My company at the time was called Kapta. Kapta still exists, and it's software in the account management space. And so in my journey with leading I was able to really start to understand how companies are thinking about the whole post-sales thing that they're doing. So this includes account management, customer success, client services. It has lots of different names. And through that journey, I really understood what mattered for people, which is how do I implement this stuff? How do I get this from being an academic exercise that I just understand into doing something I can actually implement and have that immediately start to benefit my company? And so recently, I actually left Kapta and started a new company called AMplify. That's capital A, capital M for account managers. The website's amplifyam.com. And this is a community for account managers to connect, learn, and grow together. I call it the growth community for account managers because there's so much information out there, but people want to know, hey, how are you doing this at your company? And what about this? And what about that? And get feedback and give feedback. So that's been something that's been a long time brewing for me, but we just launched. In addition to that, I'll share, and this is related to the time that you and I spent together at Techstars. I've done a lot of mentoring in the startup community. And one of the things that I realized was that entrepreneurs really want a place to call home. They want a community. They want to feel like they're not alone. So in addition to AMplify and Kapta that I was just talking about, I also run an outfit called Conscious Entrepreneur. This is both a summit, so an in-person gathering, and a podcast that we do. And it's entirely dedicated to helping entrepreneurs to scale their companies without sacrificing themselves. And the idea here is, as an entrepreneur, you want to give it your absolute best shot. And you can only do that if you're really taking care of yourself first. So those are some of the things that I'm up to today.
Oh, that's great. Well, that last point resonates with me quite a bit because I've been through the ringer when it comes to starting a company. I know how hard it can be. And when you're going through that experience, it's really helpful to have other people that have gone through it or going through it just to relate a little bit, commiserate a little bit, and maybe offer some guidance and just someone to talk to a little bit. So I love that idea. And I love what you're working on next. I think it's really deeply needed out there in the ecosphere.
Thank you. Yeah, 100%. The shift, and I'll just say that leaving a company that I founded to go do something else was a big deal, right? There's a lot of emotion around that. And I also had this feeling that, no, I've got to see this through to the end. I got to be there the entire time. But what I realized was I needed to make sure that I had my energy in the right place and I was doing what gives me energy. And one of the things that I learned is I'm really good at the early stage of a company, at a 0 to 1 stage. Once it gets to 1+, I'm less interested by it. I'm less captivated by optimizing things or refining process and stuff like that. I'm much better at highly creative, more dynamic early stages. So I'm excited to be doing that again.
Yeah, well, that's really great to hear. And the focus of our conversation here today is around account management, but specific to that 0 to 1 phase, right? With seed stage companies, you're just getting things kicked off to get started. And when do we insert those people? What's the right timing? We'll get into all that, but maybe just for those out there, maybe we could just start. Tell me a little bit about your interpretation. What is account management and why is it so important? Maybe that's a good place for us to start here.
So let me frame it this way. There's an entire pre-sales process within a company, motion, you might call it, that everyone's very familiar with. It's sales, it's pricing, it's the offer, it's marketing, it's brand development, all the things that go into acquiring a customer. And entrepreneurs put so much effort into that, right? How do I get my first customers and make sure they're paying the right price and that they understand our value proposition and all product market fit and all this kind of stuff. So that's all what I would call upstream from where my expertise lies. My expertise lies in what happens once we sign the customer. So great, we got that deal. Now what? And the now what is actually really important to understand because If you're a SaaS company, guess what? Your revenue doesn't start until you implement the customer, right? Until we start rolling. If you're a services company, your revenue doesn't start until you start delivering some of those products as well. And so having a really clear understanding of what needs to happen after the customer signs is critical. Some people call this account management, but I want to make clear that this can encompass anything from, some people might call it client services, customer success, client directors. There's lots of different names for it, but I simply would offer the umbrella term account management to consider anything that happens post sales. Now, the reason that this is important is when you look at the economics of mature companies. So this is going to be a little bit different from a startup, Larson, but for a mature company, about 71% of their revenue comes from existing customers every year. That means that new sales, the people who get all the resources and they get all of the credit, they're only delivering at the maximum 29% of revenue a year. And in years like 2023, 2024, where the economy is a little bit shifting and people aren't so sure what's going on, that number that goes through the account managers can go from 71% to 85+%. Yeah. So if you don't really understand the value of keeping a customer, then that has major implications in your business. But this is important for entrepreneurs and for startups for a couple of reasons. But one of the most critical ones, this is a number that everyone's going to understand, is your CAC to LTV ratio or your payback ratio, right? So when you look at it, you're going to spend a lot of time, especially at the beginning, acquiring new customers. Those new customers are unprofitable until a certain period of time. And there's some really crazy data about this. So you probably have seen, your audience has probably seen, there's been a lot of shifts, like all this stuff is just taking more time. But there's some recent data that I saw that the CAC payback period has increased in the last couple of years from 21 months to 48 months. Okay. So that means if a customer used to be profitable after just under 2 years, it's now taking 4 years for that customer to be profitable. And I'll get into why that might be in a second. But the impact of this is, if you're a startup, you need to keep your first customers for 4 years. Otherwise, you're losing money on them the entire time.
That's incredible. That's a crazy stat. I mean, I knew it was, my guess was going to be 18 months, but that makes sense, about 21 months. But that increase, that's drastic. And that changes the whole financial models, the business dynamics behind everything, and certainly stresses the importance of the work that you're doing. Why do you think that change has happened? Or what do you glean from that?
Well, there's some really interesting data from a company called Pavilion and a company called Ebsta. And what they did, they do these reports every 6 months or so, looking at the state of new business sales. Their recent research has shown that in the last, we'll just call it for this, what we call this tech recession, right? So for the last like 2 years or so, they've got some really alarming statistics. Looking across mainly SaaS companies, they found that win rates were down by 18%. So if I used to win, 100 deals a quarter, now I'm only winning 82 deals a quarter. So my number of wins, simply points on the board, is going down. Number two, they found that sales cycles were up 16%. Now, that may not sound like much, but going back to what we just talked about, if my sales cycle is longer, then guess what? I'm not recognizing revenue as quickly as I want. So sales cycles longer also means there's more resources, more effort going into winning that business. So it's taking longer. And because it's taking longer, we are putting more time, energy, and money into winning that customer. They also shared that deal values are down by 21%. What that means is if I used to sell $100,000 contracts, I'm now selling $80,000 contracts. Again, that's a big deal for us. And all this goes into that payback period discussion. The other piece of data that they found, and these are in slightly bigger companies than most of the folks that we're talking to here, but they found that 69% of sales reps had missed their quota in the last 6 months. So what this means is people are just out there spinning their wheels, right? It's like they're putting in so much effort and they're getting less out of it. And so that is elongating these payback periods. It's lowering the CAC to LTV ratios, right? So it's making all that more difficult. It's making the economics a lot harder. One last thing I'll share is through this same kind of research that I was learning about, it now takes 5 times more sales and marketing touches to create an opportunity. So to put that into context here, in 2018, when this is data actually from Jeremy Donovan at Insight Partners. In 2018, it took about 200 to 400 touches to create a sales opportunity. So a touch could be someone seeing an ad or them being part of an outbound email, or I meet them at a conference or stuff like that. So generally all that activity of sales and marketing, 200 to 400 touches would create a single sales opportunity for me. In 2023, Jeremy's research found it was taking 1,000 to 1,400 touches to create that same opportunity. What does this mean? All this is meaning that our sales teams and our marketing teams are working way, way more than they have in the past. And because they're working more in the past, it's more important than ever that we do something really positive, really good with the deals they're winning. So because sales is having a rough time out there, the role of post-sales account management gets much more prominent for the company.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I also say on the post-sale side, I mean, competition is becoming more fierce. There's more players than ever in the past. And so, creating an incredible post-sale experience and actually getting them to the metrics and objectives they're trying to get to is more important than ever, because that competition's right at your heels waiting to take that deal away from you. So really putting a lot of focus on the management side of the house can have a drastic impact on the business.
It does. It does. And one of the mistakes that people make here, especially in the early stage, is they're so focused on their product, right? Customers buying my thing, my way. They've got to do it the way I said. And they're testing this hypothesis of, is my product selling, instead of testing the hypothesis, which is, am I solving the customer's problem? And that's where a great account manager or a great CSM will come in and give you much deeper understanding of who is the customer, what do they care about, where they're going, what are their goals, et cetera. And therefore, what do we need to do to help them accomplish their goal or get to where they're going? So that's what a really great account management leader or individual will help you to do. And a lot of startups are blind to that, right? They think, I built a great product, everybody should just be using it like it says on the box and stuff like that. That's not really the case. So there's a lot of finesse involved here. There's a lot of skill involved in making sure that we are retaining and then growing the customers once we have them, and helping them to validate our growth hypotheses along the way.
Yeah, certainly. So that does beg a question. Just given the increased importance of the post-sale experience, when you think about the early stages, at what point in time do you think maybe a seed stage company should consider bringing on anyone in the post-sale customer management type of realm? And what do you typically look for, if you had any tips there on a persona that could be a good fit there?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't delay bringing in this type of person. And I would almost bring post sales in at the same time I'm bringing my first salesperson in. So if we assume that the founder does most of the sales at the beginning, but he or she may say, I want to bring in someone to expand the capability there, I would marry that new salesperson with a post salesperson. Now, post sales in the early stages of a company is going to do a lot of things, right? Probably including implementation, onboarding, training, customer support, all that sort of stuff. And that's to be expected. But part of what they need to be doing is continuously feeding information back to the company. Here's what we're learning about the customer. Here's what they're doing and not doing, and having success or having friction or whatever it is, like feeding that stuff back in. And so it's appropriate to remember, you're not just slapping a Band-Aid on a problem or stitching something together with glue and duct tape. The whole point of this is to have a feedback loop that we are then able to learn more from the customer. So that person should not operate in a silo, right? So it shouldn't just be some individual sitting somewhere doing this job. They need to be then plugging into, hey, product, here's what we're learning. Hey, marketing, here's what the customer is saying about the value that they're getting. And really making sure that information is flowing back up into the company so that we can learn from it. That's something that I think a lot of people think of this in terms of just a pure silo or like an individual role. At the beginning, you're going to be wearing a lot of hats. But most important is making sure that information that you get from the customer is going back to all the relevant people inside the company.
Certainly. I mean, that's really well said. I mean, you certainly are wearing a lot of hats in the early days. Everything that you mentioned, and probably many more things in addition to that are in the description and aren't in the description. So I just want to double click on the delivering feedback to the team. And when you think about that department from a metric standpoint, like, how do we deliver that information back to the team? But then also, like, how do we get a good sense on taking a higher level view of the customer base? Are there any metrics that you think about when you think about a health of an account? And then how do we deliver information back to that team, whether it be actual interviews or call recordings? Like, how do you think about all those pieces?
Yeah, there's a number of different metrics that we can look at here. And some of them are going to be behavioral or engagement metrics. So I might look across my portfolio of customers and say, for our biggest customers, I want to be meeting them in person once a quarter to talk about strategy. For the smaller customers, maybe I just want to be doing a quick check-in with them every 6 months or something like that. So we'll have a different sort of set of expectations around how we engage with the customer, right? Like, how do I manage them and so on. So we want to be tracking that. And the reason we want to do that is account management is a proactive activity, right? This is not something that we're reactive. We want to be out there, especially at the early stage, talking to them, figuring out what's next, meeting new people within the company, like all that sort of stuff. That's all part of what we want to do. So there are metrics around that level of engagement or activity. The metrics that the company, generally speaking, wants to be looking at are things like retention. So there's gross retention and net retention. There's a ratio around that, which is called NRR, net revenue retention. So how much of our revenue is being retained versus churned on any given period or with a certain cohort of customers. So I want to be aware of that. We may also be looking, especially at the early stage, at sort of cruder numbers like logo churn. So we used to have 10 customers and now we have 8. Well, that's 20% logo churn, for example. So things like that. Eventually, once we get a little bit farther along, we can start to measure growth from existing customers. We might say our existing customer base had $1 million bucket of revenue. That's now $1.25 million. So we had 25% growth from the existing base, and that's adding to our new business coming in. So that's helping to increase the curve of the revenue and stuff like that. So those tend to be really important things for us to be looking at, the activity piece, and then what are we getting out of it. I'll share here that there is one metric that I absolutely hate, which is totally useless, and somehow it's stuck in the zeitgeist and people still care about it and they still talk about it. And that metric is NPS, Net Promoter Score. Okay, Net Promoter Score is this general idea that you ask someone on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend my product or service to a friend or colleague? And there's been a lot of very interesting information about what does this mean? What does one do with an NPS? And so many boards of directors are like asking for an NPS score, and the CEO wants to have a good NPS score and so on and so forth. For the most part, especially in B2B, Larson, this is completely useless. And there's a lot of data, particularly from a guy in Utah named Greg Danes, who's done a ton of research on this. And his data shows, he's got a humongous data set. His data shows that there is absolutely zero correlation between NPS and retention, right? Meaning it has nothing to do. So you might have an NPS of 80 or you might have an NPS of 10 and they renew at exactly the same rate, which is another way of saying they churn at exactly the same rate. Mm-hmm. So I find NPS to be completely useless. It's a burden on the customer because you're asking them to do work. People don't even know what to do with the inputs once they get them back from the clients. And so that's all really, really important. So NPS is just one of these things that people are like latched onto. Now, having said that, Greg's research also then shows that there is a very strong correlation between churn or retention and not the NPS score, but whether the customer completed the survey.
Oh, interesting. Like almost engagement on that survey.
It's something like 6x difference. If they filled out the survey, then they're 6 times more likely to stick around than if they didn't. So it's a sign of engagement. It's a sign of commitment. It's a sign that they're probably already getting value. And by the way, we all know the terms like the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right?
Yeah.
So if a customer is responding, but they give you a low score, they at least went through the effort, right, of responding to give you an opportunity to fix whatever came up. So that's really interesting. So when I think of metrics, I think of those important kind of business ones. And every time I hear people's like index on NPS, I'm like, drives me crazy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it is like that is a really interesting finding to uncover there. It's like the actual score isn't really isn't that meaningful, but the engagement behind it. So here's just an off the cuff question. Do you still think it's valid or even worth it to send out an NPS survey or any type of survey in that regard? Does that give you any information that's meaningful?
Well, so it turns out there's much better ways to get this information than through an NPS survey. And the better way to do that is to become more sophisticated in your approach to customers. And specifically, how can you orient toward the goals that they have? So how deeply can you understand their goals? And based on those goals, can you measure the value that your product or service is providing back to them? Mm-hmm. Again, this is not my data. This all comes from Greg Danes. But what Greg says is, if you are able to show value back to the customer, first of all, you got to decide what to track, right? So you sell whatever it is, CRM software. And you might say, well, the value that I want to track is how much is the pipeline growing, for example. That could be a reasonable thing. And so you're showing that back to the customer. Hey, your pipeline's growing by 3%, 10%, 5%, whatever it is. The simple act, and this is important for account managers to understand, the simple act of deciding on a metric that's customer facing, meaning it's something the customer cares about, and tracking that over time, first of all, makes you look more like a strategic partner, makes you more valuable to the customer, and increases your chances of renewal and upsell, period. Simply deciding what to track. And then the amazing thing is, when you show that data back to the customer, you would think that there's some great big high bar for ROI, right? Oh, I got to show them that this is worth 10 times their investment or 3 times their investment or whatever it is. Also untrue. All you need to show to get over that initial hurdle to basically to build trust and they get the customer to say, yeah, we're going to continue. We see progress here. We see where this is going. All you need to show is $1 of improvement. Huh. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is the customer is realizing, hey, you know what? Buying that software was a pain in the ass and implementing it was a pain in the ass. And it took us all this time. We invested so much money and I had to go to my boss and ask for budget and we had to do this huge contracting thing. And it's just been this gigantic amount of effort. Okay. If I then just let you drift in the wind and say, call you up and say, hey, Larson, how's it going? Have you logged into the system? Oh, I saw that 10 people logged in. That's not interesting. That's not meaningful. But if at the end of all that effort that you've put in, I'm able to say, hey, you know what? In 6 months, we're $1 better off than we were before. Then you're able to extrapolate in the future and say, wait a minute, I get this. Now, maybe that's going to be $10, $100, $1,000, $1 million in the future.
Mm-hmm.
I understand the behavior. So coming back, I just want to focus on another point because you mentioned, like, what do people overlook here?
Yeah.
A lot of people, a lot of CEOs, a lot of startup folks, and myself included, overlook the change management required when deploying stuff to a customer, right? So behavior change is so difficult. And you literally are out there and there's methodologies. You're doing all this work, like arm twisting to get your customer to change their behavior, because that's going to be the biggest source of status quo friction for you, right? Or the inertia is simply going to be, I don't want to change. I don't have time for this. I already have a million things on my plate, that type of thing. So if you're able to show to a customer, we went through this project, here's all the things we did the behavior change, and boom, we were literally just $1 or 1% or some tiny sliver better off than we were before. The customer then starts to trust you. They believe in it. And then they see, oh, I can see how this can grow and expand.
Well, that's really great advice. And I think maybe a follow-up to that, and I'm seeing a parallel to obviously the sales cycle, is the more we can identify these true business drivers and metrics that are really deeply trying to impact, not just make more money type of stuff, the more efficient the sales cycle is, the faster it moves, the bigger the ACV. So the question to you is, given this parallel, is this something that an account manager should focus on gathering from a sales rep in like a sales to service handoff, or should they be running their own kind of kickoff call to acquire these pieces and these metrics that they're trying to impact? How do you think about that in terms of like kicking off a customer?
I actually believe it should be both, and it's a delicate balance. And so here's what I mean. Both meaning the account manager or post salesperson should be included as much as possible during the sales process, right? Once it gets to a certain stage of qualification, spend time with the sales reps, make sure they're getting the data from the CRM or whatever tool is being used. So that's really important to get that stuff done. We need to have as much there as possible. Then once the customer signs, it is appropriate for the account manager and whoever else is doing his implementation, professional services, whatever it is, to have a series of formal kickoff meetings with the customer. The reason that those are going to be different, and the reason why I encourage that is customer behavior during the sales cycle and customer behavior once they become a client are very different. And so you're just going to learn more. Like you're going to walk into that second meeting, like after they become a customer, and be like, oh shit, they didn't tell us that this thing was such a mess, or they didn't tell us that the problem was this big, or they didn't tell us that they had so few resources or whatever it is. You're going to learn all that once the ink's down on paper. Beforehand, people, especially if it's a competitive sales process, they're going to be more guarded with that information. So the account manager really wants to be doing both. And important point here is I said the account manager should come in as early as possible in the sales cycle. This is true, right? The account manager is a really powerful weapon in the sales process because they are someone who has experience working with multiple customers. So they can walk in and say, oh, well, we did this with customer A and they had this challenge and here's how we solved it. And we saw this and we saw that, what have you. That automatically puts the customer at ease because they're like, oh, I see how we've done this before. I understand. I can trust these guys a little bit better, right? Versus just a salesperson who at the back of the customer's mind, they're like, oh, the salesperson's just going to leave, right? Cycle off as soon as we sign the deal. Continuity then appears with the account manager.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice too. And I think you're spot on. The earlier you can include someone on the post-sale side of the house into the pre-sale side of the house, there's a different level of like expertise and trust from a customer standpoint to an account manager. And this is no knock on salespeople, but there is a preconceived notion about the motives of all salespeople. And you're only telling me what I want to hear versus account management. You have to deal with me. If I close, like if I'm a customer, like now you have to deal with me. You have to, we work together now. So this is the bed you made. So you got to line it.
And on top of that, like a really valuable message there is to make it very clear to the customer that your success is my success. Right. So when account managers can show up with that attitude, with that mentality, your success is my success, it really helps them to form great relationships and then achieve better outcomes too.
Certainly. So we've been talking a bit on like sales and service or account management collaboration here, involving account management early in the sales process to establish that trust. There could be a sales and service handoff where we're handing off that customer. When you think about upsells, renewals, do you see any place for sales collaboration there? Or is that just, we want account managers to be a good foothold on that? Like, how do you think about is that kind of where sales ends? Or how do you think about that piece?
Yeah, there are multiple models here. There's no necessarily right answer. And some of it can depend on who your customer is. So if you're selling to SMBs, you might look at it one way. If you're selling to mega enterprises, you might look at it another way. The way that I've seen work the most, specifically around key accounts or strategic accounts, is sales lands the customer and they get compensated for that, for example, and so on and all that. So that's part of their responsibility. And then from then on, it's handed over to an account manager, or in some cases, a whole team of account managers, right? So if you have a really big account, like your customer is Google or whatever, and you've got tons and tons of tendrils all around there and tons of potential, you might have an entire team working on one account. So from that point on, the account manager, the strategic account manager, is in charge of relationship management, renewals, upsells, identifying new opportunities, et cetera, including often penetrating new business units so that we may not have worked before. So I see that model work. Some people will break that up and they'll say, account managers do this part, but the new business units go to the sales and so on. I tend to look at it like we really want the account manager to be the CEO of the account. Think of it that way. And so they're responsible for that. And by the way, this is where that 71% of revenue comes from, right? When I said all that tends to flow through account managers, they're big and established customers. So that's something that works really well. If on the other hand, we are, maybe SMB focused or mid-sized company focused, then maybe I've got a smaller remit because I have a bigger portfolio, right? So at that point, as an account manager, instead of working 1 or 2 or 5 accounts, I might have 50 or 100 accounts. And it's just much harder for me to do any sort of effective account planning or anything like that, other than the quick renewals. And then, hey, by the way, do you want to buy our new thing?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Well, so, living back on the successful launching, do you have any principles that you follow or you really think of? Because I think the onboarding piece is really critical, but then we touch a bit on in-person quarterly events, but that's so critical as you launch. Any other principles you recommend to people as you start to work with them?
Well, renewals is a really big event, right? Especially the annual renewal. If I'm selling an annual contract, which is very typical for software companies, I'm selling an annual contract. I do not want to start my renewal process 30 days out from the renewal, right? And so what can I do to ensure or basically increase my confidence that the customer is going to renew? Well, it starts with the onboarding. It starts with, do I really understand their goals and their needs and their challenges? Have we invested in change management and any kind of support around that? Do we have the right relationship coverage within this account, right? So do I have the appropriate executive sponsor relationships, decision makers, champions, influencers? Do I have them identified? By the way, part of my job as an account manager is to make sure I'm working all of those people, right? So those are all going to go into being very effective at identifying risks to the renewal, for example. We also then can start looking at things like, am I doing in-person business reviews with the customer? So these are sometimes called QBRs or quarterly business reviews. So if I'm doing the QBR with the customer, is it valuable? Are we sharing insights with the client? Are we asking them questions? Are we making this a discussion rather than just making it like a presentation all about me and my stuff? So that's a big problem that a lot of people have. Also, do we have some type of strategy document? This can be an account plan, the North Star metrics, the measuring value that I was talking about before. Mm. If I do any of those things, I want to do that right from the beginning, right? Because that's when we have the opportunity to set the stage and frame the whole thing and say, here's how we're going to do this. We want to start as soon as possible. By the way, sometimes we have this misconception that a customer will resist that, right? They won't want to do all this stuff. But at the beginning of the partnership, that is the time, and customers will appreciate you being proactive, you being prescriptive with them. So you show up and you say, hey, here's how we do things and here's why we do it because it's going to help you be more successful. For someone who's invested any amount of money with you, they suddenly feel, okay, great, they got my back, right? They know what they're doing. And that's really what we want to leave the customer with, that feeling of they've got my back.
Certainly. Yeah. And it just starts them off on the right foot. And I'm dealing with a true professional here. I'm in good hands is really the kind of feeling you want them to leave with. You know what this feels like? A kickoff call on the post-sale side is very equivalent to a discovery call on the pre-sale side.
Yeah.
Where you're gathering facts and there's always that same hesitation on, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions, but they don't answer my questions. But if you don't do that and put in that work and give context behind why you're asking the questions, correct, that will come to bite you in the end. And you're going to run into some serious problems because you didn't uncover that information. It sounds like that's almost exactly analogous to the post-sale side.
Well, it's funny. I was just talking about this with our AMplify community yesterday. So I mentioned we're building this community for account managers at AMplify. We had our kickoff call yesterday, October 1st. And one of the questions was, what do we do when we are supposed to go talk to a customer and they just don't open up? Right? They're just not telling us. And they could say things like, I don't know the answer, or they simply refuse to tell you. They don't see why you would need that information. And at the very beginning, we can support this whole conversation by saying, hey, when we worked with other customers, they had X, Y, and Z challenge or friction point, right, around these issues. Once you start to communicate that context, the customer will be like, okay, now I see why they're asking. I understand. I'm willing to open up. Because when you look under the covers for a lot of companies, like your customers, there's all sorts of nasty stuff in there, right? There's all sorts of things that they don't want to talk about, that they don't want you to see. So you need to tell them, look, we need to uncover this stuff soon, right? Because we're all about ensuring your success here. And that's how we're going to get there. So yeah, discovery is a very, very powerful tool for us in that phase as well.
Absolutely. Well, and I like I'll use this in sales cycles as well, as other customers we're working with struggle with X, Y, and Z things, or for this customer, I'm thinking of to get them to a successful outcome, we needed to understand these key metrics first. It's almost like by analogy, or this is what we do for everybody to get you to success. And a lot of times that disarms people, or just go like, oh, you work with people like me, so this is a part of the process.
Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. Well, I think as we kind of wrap up here, we are quickly approaching 2025. So when you think about 2025, the landscape is all changing here. You just mentioned a few facts on the beginning of this call about your lifetime value and how that your CAC your payback time is increasing. So when you think about 2025 and must-haves or key recommendations for the upcoming years, do you have any ideas for folks out there about really key points that should be focused on?
Well, there's a big conversation going on right now in the customer success world, and it's starting to overlap with account managers. And the conversation is, should customer success basically be all about helping customers get implemented and up and running and supported along their journey, or should they also own revenue, renewals, upsells, and stuff like that? Mm-hmm. And every time I hear this conversation with this question go, I kind of cringe, because my view on this, so I'm a CEO and entrepreneur and someone who's worked in a lot of different companies and a lot of different environments. Let me put it this way. The farther you are from revenue, the less valuable you are to the company, or at least you're perceived as less valuable. Therefore, your job is more at risk. Therefore, people care less about what you do. So if you're in any type of post-sale role, and you don't have total clarity on how you are impacting revenue, do everything you can today to change that. Get as close to revenue as you can. Become a renewals manager, right? Or offer to take care of upsells, or whatever it is. Get as close to revenue as you can. Because right now it's heartbreaking to see this conversation in the customer success world where people are like, oh, no, I really like helping customers, but the sales part is icky to me, or I don't like the revenue part. I'm thinking, this is going to be a problem eventually, right? So
Yeah, you got to get over that really quickly.
so we better get over this, especially in an age of profitability first,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is a big driver for so many companies. My main advice to anyone thinking about how to craft this sort of team or take on this sort of role is get as close to revenue as you can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really well said. There's more and more pressure happening, as we've talked about throughout this discussion here. But if you can really prove yourself to be someone to help with that net retention and bringing in more revenue and help with renewals, like you're going to have a really good spot. You're going to build some new skills that maybe you didn't have in the past. Maybe sales doesn't become quite as icky to you as you learn that a bit more. Because once you learn the skill set behind it, it really can work out in spades and be quite beneficial for your career.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a big conversation that we've had with AMplify, for example, is people understanding where they belong and where they should be. And my view is always get as close to the revenue as you can, because guess what your CEO cares about? Revenue. Guess what the entire C-suite cares about? Revenue. Just be there.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's excellent. Well, so I really appreciate this conversation here today, Alex. So there's two things I want to close on here. So if I'm either an account manager or I'm a founder looking to build my CS team or account management team, and I want to get involved with AMplify, tell me more about what that is. And like, how do I get in touch with you and how do I get involved with this community?
Yeah. So AMplify is a community for us to gather together and figure this all out, right? Hey, what's going on? How do I become the best at account management? How do I deliver the maximum value to my customer and therefore to my company? Those sorts of things. How do I learn from other people who are out there? So it's really a professional and career development community that we're building here. And everyone's welcome who wants to explore, whether you're far along in your career or just starting, or even just an executive trying to understand what the dynamics here look like. So AMplify is open to anyone who's looking for that. The website is AMplifyAM.com. So AMplifyAM.com will get you there with all the information. We've also launched a podcast called Account Management Secrets. This is a great way to understand what we talk about, what are the themes, give you some ideas on how to think about everything from QBRs to net revenue retention to the role of the chief customer officer to how I structure my team to how I compensate people. All that stuff is part of what we're talking about there within that Account Management Secrets podcast. So that's also really fun as well. Personally, I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn, and that's probably a great place to get a hold of me and to follow me. But we'd love to have anyone who's interested in the account management or post-sale world come check out AMplify.
That's great. And then the last is, let's say I'm an entrepreneur and I'm really struggling with how difficult this journey is. When is the next Conscious Entrepreneur Summit? Tell me more about how that's looking over the next year or so and what's all in store for that.
Yeah, Conscious Entrepreneur Summit started in 2022. So we've had 3 of them so far. We don't yet have dates for 2025, but we're working on that. And the whole idea here is to understand that you're not alone. This is a lot of entrepreneurs carry this burden of I'm doing this on my own. There's a lot of stress and anxiety associated with that. None of that is good for your health or, by the way, good for your performance as a CEO. And so that's what we do a lot of talking about and making sure that we're supporting one another during that process. So that website is consciousentrepreneur.us. I know those are 2 very hard words to spell, Conscious Entrepreneur, but if you just Google some approximation of that, you'll find us.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm excited to see that all come to light, and I really love what you're doing with AMplify. And it just got started, but that's a hot start so far, and I really love the content you're putting out there. So, just want to thank you for spending some time with me here today to talk a little bit more about account management, and really just hope you have a great rest of your day, Alex. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Larson. Great to see you.